What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another Magic the Gathering video. And today we're going to be taking a look at the Ruby Storm deck for the Modern format. Arguably one of Modern's fastest decks in the format, getting to win on turn 2 or turn 3 very consistently. And on top of that is going to be virtually ban-proof in this coming ban and restricted announcement. So definitely a deck that I think, at least in the later parts of this format and the early onset of the next one, is going to be pretty well set up just for the fact that it does have that tremendous amount of speed getting to win the game on turn 2 or turn 3, especially brutal if you were on the play. And of course, people are going to be trying to figure out the format. They're going to be trying new archetypes as well as kind of tweaking some of the old ones that, were kind of tuned to beat some of the other top decks of the format. So I think it's going to be pretty good on the early onset of the next format. But if you want to get my full breakdown of predictions of this ban restricted announcement, potentially the winners and losers of that announcement, and so on and so forth, as well as a lot of these other videos where we talk a lot about the modern and standard formats. We go over various different deck lists, a lot of the events and stuff going on, metagame breakdowns, all those sort of things. So if you are interested in any of that stuff, please consider subscribing and ring that notification bell so you know when future videos get posted. It's a free, easy way to support me and my content. And if you enjoyed this video, if you are just entertained by it, you learned something, please consider leaving a like and, of course, a comment down below of what modern deck you would like to see next. I do read all the comments. I try my best to reply to as many of them as I can. So again, please do that, and I will be sure to check them out, and I will take your suggestions into consideration. On top of all that, if you are interested in even more content from me, if you go down in the description down below, I do have a link to my Discord server that you can go and follow and join over there, as well as my Twitch channel. We did get a few followers on this last stream. I am very grateful and appreciative of any and all support on the YouTube and the Twitch channel. So go ahead and check out the Twitch channel over there where we do play a lot of live Magic here. I try to go live at least once or twice a week, hopefully to get it up to more days once we kind of get more followers and stuff. Checking out the channel over there. And of course, you can check out the Casual Spikes podcast YouTube channel, where me and my co-host Randy over at MTG with Randy talk everything and anything competitive Magic to try to help you prepare for your future regional championship or regional championship qualifier event. We do go pretty in depth on kind of the metagame breakdown of all these major events, as well as just the metagame itself. So definitely go ahead and check out that channel if you want more competitive Magic content. And lastly, I want to thank the sponsor of the channel, Manatraders. If you use my code in the description down below, you will get 5% off your monthly subscription. And Manatraders makes it super easy to rent decks such as this, test them out, and if you don't like them, or for whatever the case may be, you can end up swapping out decks at your leisure that you can figure out what decks that you want to play for your upcoming competitive event. So definitely check out the sponsor with the code down below, sign up, and everything is, 5% off. That's pretty huge, honestly, this day and age. But yeah, go ahead. I would like to thank the sponsor of the channel, Manatraders, and let's go ahead and get into this Ruby Storm deck. So this list in particular is piloted by Mikey Bashara at the SCG Con Charlotte, which was the regional championship in Charlotte. And for those of you that don't know, Mikey Bashara is Young Dingo over on Twitch, a very, very, very good Magic player, featured pretty heavily, I would say, on the Apex Gaming Invitational season, which is going to be starting up actually at the end of this month. I believe it ends up being March 29th through the 30th. So definitely check it out there. They got a lot of cool events and stuff going on there. Go ahead and check out their store. They're pretty awesome. But this Ruby Storm deck, I would kind of categorize it in a few different ways, just to kind of split up the cards to make this relatively easy. There's 8 really important cards in this deck. All right, and with storm decks in the past, we're used to seeing them be like these blue-red strategies, where the blue's like there for the cantrips, and of course for the cost reducers. With the release of Modern Horizons 3, this deck is actually able to basically be straight mono red, splashing a little bit of white just because there is kind of that flexibility for it. You also kind of want to be playing some of these Surveil lands as well, because turns out they are very, very good, and people grossly underestimated them when they were first spoiled. But with cards like Ruby Medallion and Ral Monsoon Mage being printed in Modern Horizons 3, it allowed this deck to essentially be that one color splashing a second color, rather than being kind of in between on this like blue and red strategy. So Ral Monsoon Mage is arguably the better of the two here. Ruby Medallion just says that your red spells cost 1 less to cast, which obviously is all of our spells minus like Prismatic Ending and Orum's Chant on the sideboard. But we get this cost reduction across all of our main deck spells, which is obviously going to be better for all the rituals and stuff that we're going to get to later. Ral Monsoon Mage only gives your instants and sorceries cost 1 less to cast, so obviously your other Rals, which isn't really going to do you much of anything unless you flip this Ral first, or Ruby Medallion, Artist Talent, whatever. but it does reduce the cost of over half your deck, so definitely filling that important role. And whenever you cast a sorcery spell during your turn, you flip a coin, and if you lose the flip, Ral Monsoon Mage deals 1 damage to you. If you win the flip, you may exile Ral. If you do, return him to the battlefield transform under his owner's control. And that's important because Ral enters the battlefield with an additional loyalty counter on him for each instant and sorcery spell you cast this turn. So ideally, with Ral Monsoon Mage in play, you end up casting at least 6 instant or sorcery spells, so you can get to that -8 ability on the back of Ral. And it says that when you exile the top 8 cards of your library, you may cast instant sorcery spells from among them this turn without paying their mana cost. This is essentially a way that your cost reducer, after you've cast a bunch of rituals and things like that, you can then exile the top 8 cards, or top 8 cards of your library, cast more rituals, cast more of these other impulse draw effects that we have, and you are able to just continue to chain and go off, add to your storm count to eventually win with Storm's very famous win condition of Grape Shot. So these are your cost reducers. These are arguably the most important cards. These are the cards you're looking to play on turn 2 to make it a heck of a lot easier to go off on turn 3, but we'll kind of get into some of the ways that you can turn 2 here later in the video. So there's like your cost reducers. That's step 1. Step 2 is like the actual like rituals and stuff. That's obviously this deck is going to be very mana intensive. There's no way that you're going to be able to get enough lands in play to where your opponent hasn't already won the game against you. So how are you going to generate enough mana to kind of keep things going? Well, as we stated earlier, you have what we call rituals. So we have Desperate Ritual, we have Manamorphose, Pyretic Ritual are like you're just straight up like you cast these and you end up getting mana back. So Pyretic Ritual and Desperate Ritual here. You pay 2 mana, you end up getting 3 red mana. Desperate Ritual, you can splice onto Arcane, which usually means if you have like 2 Desperate Rituals, you end up netting some mana along the way. Cast a 1 mana Desperate Ritual, splice on Arcane, another one for 1 mana, then you're going to end up adding 6 mana, and you still have the other copy of Desperate Ritual in your hand, so you can cast it again and generate even more mana. Pyretic Ritual, not that fancy, just straight up 2 mana, get 3 mana back. Manamorphose, you can pay 2 mana and you get mana, add 2 mana in any combination of colors, and then you draw a card. Obviously, these are even better with cost reducers because Manamorphose just, you spend 1 mana to get 2 mana back and draw a card. Desperate Ritual and Pyretic Ritual then do their best impression of a red dark ritual at that point. There's also this card Striker Rich, which again also kind of helps you in those turn 2 scenarios where you just play Striker Rich on turn 1, you end up playing your second land, you have 3 mana, you're able to play a Ral or a Ruby Medallion and then cast one of these rituals for 1 mana using your treasure token that you made to then just again get mana in your pool and then go and cast the second part of the spells that you're looking to cast, which are these impulse effects. So you have 4 Reckless Impulse, you have 4 Rends Resolve, and you have 2 Glimpse the Impossible. Reckless Impulse and Rends Resolve are essentially the same cards, where for 2 mana you can exile up the top 2 cards of your library, and until the end of your next turn you may play those cards. So this is also a way that you could like play this on turn 2, maybe if you don't have a cost reducer, and you can just exile the top 2 cards of your library, potentially hit your 3rd land while also trying to dig for maybe another ritual, maybe you're looking for a cost reducer, whatever the case may be, because these cards aren't going to go away until the end of your next turn, so they're going to be there through the next turn cycle up until that next turn. So definitely very helpful if you're just trying to dig for certain pieces. Maybe if you're like, okay, again, like being a cost reducer being the big thing, maybe you're digging for one of those, or you end up hitting another Rends Resolve or Reckless Impulse off of that previous Rends Resolve or Reckless Impulse to kind of keep going and keep adding cards to hopefully generate enough mana or just generate enough raw cards to where you're able to actually go off and win the game. Glimpse the Impossible is a pretty weird one because this is for 3 mana and you exile 3 cards, the top 3 cards from your library. You may play those cards this turn, so you don't get that whole turn cycle or whatever. You don't get to untap and have your mana for the next turn. This requires you to play them that turn. But then at the beginning of the next end step, if any of those cards remain exiled, you put them into your graveyard, and then you create 01 colorless Eldrazi spawn tokens for each card put into the graveyard this way. So can be like kind of a weird ramp card, which I'm not sure for the life of me how often that would actually come up. But usually the fact that you have to play them this turn, you're usually able to cast Glimpse with some amount of mana floating in your mana pool or untapped lands, whatever the case may be. So you can kind of cast those spells because that's where they're important. But if you end up needing kind of that burst of mana where you need to have 6-7 mana going into like say turn 3 or turn 4, well then you're able to actually put those cards into your graveyard, which are going to set up some of the other cards that care about the things in our graveyard, while also generating more mana to potentially play through maybe some hate pieces that your opponent has brought in for you. So that's pretty sweet. And the graveyard cards that we kind of care about are Past in Flames. This has essentially been a Storm staple forever. It's been a combo staple forever. 4 mana, each instant sorcery card in your graveyard gains flashback until end turns. Flashback cost is equal to its mana cost, and it has flashback of 5 mana. This is a card that is pretty tricky to play with in paper, I would say, because you have to kind of like at that point separate your graveyard and start another graveyard. Because if you cast an insert sorcery that doesn't have flashback after you've cast a Past in Flames, it does not have flashback when it goes to the graveyard. So you kind of have to keep them separate from the other cards that actually do have flashback and those sort of things. And again, that's why we talk about with Glimpse, where it's kind of weird that this kind of impulse effect does end up putting those cards back in the graveyard rather than exiling them, because normally with effects like that, they just end up getting exiled and they stay exiled. So definitely really neat there. We also have Valakut Awakening, which doubles as a land. Can also just help us get rid of excess lands from our hands, draw more cards. Also, in the worst case, if it's like the only card in our hand, we can pay 3 mana to essentially cycle it. So it's kind of like, if you think about it, it's kind of like a triome in that way. If you really want to get technical about it, but that's pretty cool. And before we get to the wish and we start talking about this wish board here, I want to talk about Artist Talent, because this is a card that we saw a lot in Pioneer with the Blue-Red Phoenix decks, and we're seeing it now in Modern as 2 copies in the Storm deck. So on a baseline, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you may discard a card. If you do draw a card for 3 mana, it ends up being essentially another one of those cost reducers where non-creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, not making your Rouse cheaper, but does make the other Artist Talent cheaper, your Rune Medallion, and all your other rituals and kind of these impulse draw effects. And for another 3 mana, Sorcery Control would deal non-combat damage to an opponent or permanent. It deals that much damage plus 2. So this is like a way that you can kind of cheat on Storm count, where you can end up casting a Grave Shot for, what is it, like 7 or 8 Storm, and that's going to end up being like 21, 24 damage to your opponent, which is going to be more than enough in a format that is really heavily reliant on fetch lands and shock lands and things like that, where you're going to be able to deal damage to your opponent. Also, people will just end up dealing incidental damage themselves. So really, you could end up getting to a point where you just add a bunch of mana and just cast a bunch of rituals, play an Artist Talent, dig through your deck, play all your rituals out, play a Past in Flames, and then just level this up to 2 and 3, cast a Grape Shot, and your opponent's dead. So I mean, this is a pretty interesting addition to the deck, and I think a really good one at that, because it's not really out of the realm of possibility of spending 7, 8 mana to just fully level this up on the same turn and just end up lethaling your opponent here. But we go back to Wish. Wish is a very interesting card, because for 3 mana, you can play a card you own from outside of the game this turn. This doesn't require you to cast a card right now. It just says that you may play a card you own from outside of the game this turn. So this is like also kind of interesting here too. You can play a land from your sideboard if you do have it, which is pretty neat. Obviously, it doesn't really come up here in this scenario in specific, but nonetheless, it's still kind of a neat thing that you can do with this Wish if you decide to board a land out, if that's, kind of your thing. But Wish allows us to cast any one of these cards from outside our deck. Some of the main ones being like Past in Flames. This is a way that, we always have access to a Past in Flames, so we essentially have 5 in our deck, even though this one's going to cost a lot more. Usually when you're kind of going off, it doesn't matter. You end up having a bunch of mana left over. You're going to play a bunch of rituals. You're going to be able to spend 2 mana or 1 mana on a Wish to then pay 3 mana or 2 mana for a Past in Flames, and just recast all your rituals and get all your mana back right away. We have Empty the Warrens, which creates 2 1/1 Goblin creature tokens. If your opponent ends up giving themselves hexproof or whatever the case may be, you can use Empty the Warrens to just make a bunch of Goblin tokens and end up just swinging and winning the game that way. Where obviously Grape Shot, though, is the way that we kind of want to win the game here, as we do have 1 in our sideboard and 1 in our main deck. So this essentially can't get touched by our mill opponents deciding to surgical our win condition. Ain't gonna happen. We also have Underworld Breach here, which is a card that we do kind of expect to see getting a ban here in the near future, but only 1 copy in here. It ends up being probably pretty halfway decent when you're just trying to play Grape Shot over and over again. You just have a bunch of mana and you're like, okay, I gotta stock Graveyard, Grape Shot you, Grape Shot you, Grape Shot you, and you just end up killing your opponent relatively easily. We can see you have 2 Abrade here. Pretty simple. Destroy target artifact, deal 3 damage to target creature. Ends up being pretty good against some of the other, like hate pieces that our opponents could be playing. And then we have 4 Prismatic Ending, 4 Orm's Chant. These cards usually end up coming in the sideboard games. Orm's Chant being a way that you can stop your opponent from casting spells this turn, and the spell's kicked. The creatures can't attack this turn. This is like a way that you can kind of lock your opponent out of casting spells on your turn, making it easier for you to go off. Or if you just need to stop your combo opponent from casting spells on that turn, then you're able to stop them from being able to combo on their turn to then being able to combo on your turn. Prismatic Ending also just being kind of a nice catch-all removal spell. There are ways that we can generate any kinds of mana thanks to cards like Strike It Rich and Manamorphose, so we can kind of increasingly hit higher and higher costed cards with this Prismatic Ending. So it just makes it a very flexible removal spell for various different hate pieces, for different creatures, and so on and so forth, to try to get us to live to the point where we can actually combo off and win the game. I did say that there were some ways that this deck does win on turn two, so I just kind of wanted to explain everything that was going on here. So you do have Strike It Rich, was one of the ways that we pointed out. You Strike It Rich on turn one, Cost Reducer on turn two, then you crack the treasure to play a ritual, and you kind of, go off from there. It's not deterministic necessarily, but, chances are if you're going for it on turn two, you have a very high likelihood of actually winning the game. You also just have the classic, like, turn two, play your second land, play a Desperate Ritual, play a Row or a Ruby Medallion, and then play another ritual effect to go from 1 mana up to 3 mana. So that is like another way that you can end up winning the game on turn two. And those are really kind of the basic ways, but very easily able to set up like turn two or turn three wins just by simply playing one of your cost reducers on turn two, and then either off of a ritual or after playing a Strike It Rich, you end up just getting to continue to cast rituals, cast these impulse draws, to find more rituals, to find more impulse draws, to eventually find Past in Flames, to cast them all over again, and then cast Grape Shot a bunch of times to end up killing your opponent. Overall, I do really like the Storm deck, as I say with a lot of these decks that I end up featuring. So this is a deck that I think is, on the surface, is a pretty good deck to play, and I think if you kind of understand the intricacies of the modern format and kind of understand your role in certain matchups, this is a deck that is relatively easy to play. I think that it also does just kind of get some free wins. Sometimes your opponent's mulligan to like 5 or 6 cards, and then they have to kind of keep any kind of hand that functions. Maybe it has some kind of hate piece, but if that hate piece isn't something like a Rest in Peace or a Soul Guide Lantern, for example, it's very easy for you just to kind of go off and win the game. Again, it's another deck that, I would say has a very high game one win rate, and you just have to figure out how to win one of the sideboarded games, which can kind of be a knock to the deck itself, because there's been plenty of times where I've won game one and have not won game two or game three just because my opponent has drawn plenty of different sideboard hate. Also, the fact that, Underworld Breach combo is one of the best decks in the format right now. Players are packing a lot of graveyard hate and, stopping players from casting cards, for free, that sort of thing. And this deck does kind of fold to a lot of that interaction as well. So there's some incidental sideboard hate for this deck. But obviously, this deck does have a lot of potential. Again, this got 11th place at the regional championship. Players were gunning for Breach here, which means like on an unrelated kind of avenue, they were also kind of prepared for Ruby Storm, and these players just, seemingly couldn't beat this one player. Mikey is a very good player as well, so definitely a deck that I think is worth looking into here for this part of the format, where I think if you can play through kind of all this hate now and have some relative success, then I think you're going to be pretty well set up for the future to, at least here in the early parts of the format after the ban restricted announcement, to perform very well with this deck. Storm is definitely something that players have to, if you're playing in the modern format, you have to have some kind of a game plan for Storm. And if you are the Storm player, you just have to kind of board in assuming that your opponent is going to be bringing in a lot of hate and figure out accordingly to kind of beat them, while also figuring out like what cards you're supposed to cut and if you're overboarding and things like that. Kind of a benefit for the Storm deck as well versus the like Team or Breach decks, where, for better or for worse, you're essentially married to playing Storm, like building up a huge Storm count, and then being able to grape shot your opponent for lethal or playing and empty the Warrens. Whereas for like Breach, you have kind of this dance where you can kind of board into this, mid-rangey type deck and then back to the combo deck and things like that. So definitely, I would say the lack of choice could be a good thing or a bad thing depending on who you are for the Storm deck, where you're not kind of stuck trying to, zig when your opponent thinks you're going to zag or whatever, and potentially lining up worse against your opponent. So that's something that Ruby Storm kind of has a benefit for it. But again, that's gonna do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like on the video. Of course, comment down below what modern deck you would like to see next. Check out all the links in the description down below. Of course, subscribe to the channel, all that fun stuff. Ring the notification bell so you know when future videos get posted. That's gonna do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed it. And I'll see you all in the next one.